Hello, and welcome to week 6 of this educational series. This week we're going to cover sensory processing. If you have not had the chance to tune into the last 5 weeks of sessions, we have already covered postpartum physical and mental health, NICU care, child attachment and development. All of those sessions are accessible on our website, which I have linked at the end of this slideshow. If you don't know me, my name is Grace, and I'm a third-year occupational therapy student. I am a mom to a 1-year-old, and occupational therapy is centered around what we call occupations. Occupations are the things that we want or need to do in a day that are meaningful to us. So, some of my favorite occupations are playing with my daughter, going on walks during sunset, and binge watching TV shows with my husband. If you're tuning in on our YouTube channel, this survey is still open and I would appreciate any feedback that I can get. It's very brief and it is anonymous. It just aims to give me insight on the effectiveness of the session and how to make it better. These are the topics that we're going to cover today, and we're just going to jump right in with talking about what is sensory processing. Sensory processing involves the brain taking in information from the environment or from our bodies. It then has to organize this information in order to help us develop a response. This process helps us understand safety threats, complete tasks, socialize with others, and more. Typically, when we talk about sensory processing, we refer to 8 senses. So we have our typical 5 that almost everybody is familiar with. We have sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. But then we have 3 others that oftentimes are not as well known. So proprioception refers to the amount of force that we put through our muscles and our joints. This sense helps us understand how we're moving and our body's position in space. The vestibular sense helps us understand where our head is in relation to gravity. So with this sense, a lot of times we see it come into play with balance. Finally, interoception is our internal body sensations. So this is when your body is telling you that you need to use the bathroom or that you're hungry or you're full. And with sensory processing, we also have sensory processing disorder. So this is also called SPD. SPD is the result of differences in the process of taking in, organizing, and responding to sensory information. Sensory processing is kind of like fingerprints. No one person processes sensory information the same, but not everybody has SPD. So the distinguishing factor between someone with slight sensory processing differences and SPD is when the processing differences cause disruption in occupational participation. So let me give you an example. A child who gets mildly uncomfortable by loud and busy environments is invited to a birthday party, and afterwards they request more quiet time, which would indicate maybe they are a little bit more sensitive to auditory information. But this child can still participate in the event and they can tolerate it in order to participate with their friends and play and sing happy birthday. This would be different than a child who gets invited to a birthday party and the minute they walk in the door, all of the noise overwhelms them, so they cover their ears and they immediately start crying. It gets to the point where they have to leave the birthday party and they can't participate. This would indicate sensory processing disorder because it impacts the child's ability to stay at the said event in this example and to participate in their occupations like play, socialization, etc. SPD is not currently a standalone diagnosable condition in the DSM-5, so it's oftentimes seen as a symptom or a comorbidity that accompanies another condition. Two common ones that it's typically seen with are ADHD or autism. And the root cause of SPD is unknown, although there are thoughts on Several different factors that could contribute to this difficulty, such as genetics, early life experiences, etc. Sensory processing disorder is often referred to as an umbrella term. So, sensory processing disorder encompasses three separate subtypes that you may encounter. The first is sensory modulation disorder. This is the ability to regulate and respond appropriately to sensory input. Under this disorder, we see three different responses. I'm going to go over each of these separately here in a minute, but I want to give just a brief description of each. Sensory overresponsivity is when the sensory input coming in is too overwhelming, and for a lot of kids, this leads to meltdowns. Sensory underresponsivity is when a child needs a lot of sensory input in order for them to respond or even notice something going on. Sensory craving is when a child seeks out sensory information almost like they can't get enough of it. The second disorder that is categorized under SPD is sensory discrimination disorder. This is the ability to recognize and distinguish sensory input. I will go over this a little bit more here in a minute. Finally, we have sensory-based motor disorder. This is the ability to coordinate movements of the body in response to sensory input. So under this disorder, we have postural disorder, which is typically when the body fatigues and physically struggles to maintain its position in order to complete activities. And we have dyspraxia, which is essentially the body's ability to understand, plan, and execute motor movements. I'm going to dive into each of these just a little bit further. So let's look first at sensory modulation disorder. On the last slide, I talked about there being three subtypes listed: the sensory craving, underresponsivity, and overresponsivity. Overresponsivity. On this slide, you can see that there are four, and the reason for that is that sensory sensitivity and sensory avoiding are both categorized under that overresponsivity reaction. So those are typically kind of grouped together, but they are different. So we're going to go over that. When a child with sensory processing disorder receives sensory input from the environment or their body, there are typically these four responses that we'll see emerge. And I want to preface that an individual can experience every single one of these responses depending on the sense. So the same child who might seek out vestibular input by spinning may also avoid auditory input by covering their ears to loud noises or when in public places. Every child is unique in the way they process sensory input. So if you need additional guidance with this, definitely consult an occupational therapist. The first one we're going to talk about is sensory seeking. This means that a child has a very high tolerance for sensory input, meaning that they want more and more of it in order for their nervous system to feel regulated. At the same time, a sensory seeker will take active steps to achieve this extra sensory input. This typically is seen as the kids who will spin nonstop, who chew on non-food items, or a lot of times who are always roughhousing with others. Sensory avoiding is when a child has a low tolerance for sensory input. So it only takes a little bit of input before it feels like too much. These children will typically take active steps to avoid the sensory input coming in. So for example, like I've said before, they may cover their ears and run away when the vacuum starts. That running away is them actively taking the steps to avoid that sensory input. Sensory sensitivity are the children that also have low tolerance for sensory input, but the difference is that they passively address it. So an example may be that they complain about the tags in the back of their clothes, but they don't do something in that moment to stop the sensation. And finally, we have low registration. These are the kiddos who have a very high tolerance for sensory input, but they use passive strategies to obtain that extra input. So a lot of times these are the kids that miss verbal instructions or seem distracted because it takes a lot more input for them to maintain their attention. But they do not take active steps to seek that information. So they may not ask to be moved to the front of the room. They may not ask a teacher to explain more because it's more of a passive approach. These kids, a lot of times, often appear like they have low energy or they're really sluggish. So it takes a lot of pushing from others to get them motivated and wanting to participate. Another way that we can talk about sensory modulation disorder that I think sometimes makes it just a little bit more digestible is called the sensory cup theory. So every person has a different size sensory cup or sensory thresholds. And like I said, the size of our sensory cup or our threshold can vary for every single sense. So some people might have a very large tactile cup, which means that they can take in as much tactile information as possible and it doesn't cause any overflow. But maybe they have a small visual cup, so bright lights bother them very, very easily. The size of these cups determines how much sensory input a person needs or can handle before feeling overwhelmed. So you can see in the cups pictured here on the slide, let's just say that each cup is a different child. So for child number 1, that's going to be the large one. This large sensory cup, you can see 3 drops trickling in. For this child, they're currently sitting, spinning in a chair under bright fluorescent lights while their mom is vacuuming the floor. And for them, this is probably fine. And more than likely, it's probably helping them obtain the sensory input that they want to help their nervous system feel more regulated. And it's going to take a lot more sensory input for this cup to even reach full, let alone overflow. The kiddo in the middle has a medium-sized cup. So say they're in the same situation as the first kid. They're spinning on a chair under bright fluorescent lights while their mom is vacuuming. Their sensory cup is going to fill up much faster than kiddo 1, and any additional sensory information could cause their cup to fill and overflow, which can lead to feelings of overwhelm and meltdowns. Kiddo 3 here on the right has a very small sensory cup. So more than likely in our stimulated situation where they're spinning under bright lights on a chair while their mom vacuums, their cup is probably at this point way past full, and they're probably already in a meltdown from the overwhelming amount of sensory input. These kiddos are generally seen kind of as that sensory sensitive type. Now again, I gave an example as if each of these cups were a different child, but we can also look at each of these cups for different sensory systems for one child. So let's say cup 1 is for the proprioceptive symptom or system. The second cup is for the olfactory or the smell, and the third cup is for the auditory. So this child would be able to tolerate a lot of proprioceptive input. They like to jump and climb and crash, and it doesn't cause their proprioceptive cup to overfill because that cup is very large. They can tolerate somewhat neutral smells, so things like the smell of laundry soap is fine, but if you add in something like a really strong cologne, this cup has a higher chance of overflowing faster. And their auditory cup, the one on the right, is so small that something as simple as a blender, a vacuum, a dog barking can send this system into overload. When our sensory cups overflow, like I said, that's when we oftentimes become overstimulated and it leads to a meltdown. We're trying to figure out what our bodies need and we don't know how to obtain that. And so a lot of times, especially for children, it results in crying, yelling, etc. Okay, that was a lot of information. So if you have additional questions on that or concerns regarding your child, I would definitely talk to an occupational therapist. They can look more individualized at your child's sensory needs. But let's move more into talking about sensory discrimination disorder. Sensory discrimination disorder, like I said earlier, is difficulty in the way our brains recognize and interpret different sensory experiences. So I just want to kind of breeze through all 8 senses to give an example of how sensory discrimination disorder can impact the sense. With the tactile sense, we often see that children have difficulty identifying objects by just feeling them. So they have to be able to see them to really understand what it is and how to use it. And this is called stereognosis, which is the ability to not look at an object and just touch it and be able to identify what it is. This can be essential for tasks like buttoning buttons, pulling items out of your backpack, etc. And so, if they're having difficulty with this, it can make that extremely more difficult. With the proprioceptive sense, these kiddos will typically have difficulty determining the just right amount of force to apply to objects. So they might break all their pencils when they're writing, or they may play too rough with other children and have a hard time maintaining friendships. With the vestibular sense, these children have difficulty determining where their head is in space. And so it can cause some problems with protective responses, such as if they're tipping over backward, being able to catch themselves. And a lot of these children oftentimes end up with a few more bumps and bruises than is typical for children. The olfactory and gustatory senses, so those ones are separated on the chart, but I want to talk about them together because these two are typically kind of deemed less detrimental to daily activity participation, but it still can cause some difficulty. So I think this will often become an issue, maybe more so as an adult. If you're cooking a meal and you can't identify the smell of your food burning, you smell something, but I don't know what it is. Or if you're getting ready to cook a meal and the milk is spoiled and you can't smell or taste that the milk is spoiled, you could use it anyway and it could make you sick. So, just some ways that the smell and the taste systems can be impacted. With the auditory system, these children have a hard time hearing and differentiating sounds. So, a lot of times it seems like they're not listening because all of the sounds in the room are of equal volume to them. So, you might be talking directly to them, but they're having a hard time differentiating that. This can also cause difficulty with children being able to modulate tone of voice. So you might be in a movie theater and your child is essentially yelling because they have difficulty modulating that tone of voice. With the visual system, these kiddos typically have difficulty processing the information that they see. So this can lead to more trouble with reading facial expressions or even with academics. It can cause difficulty with reading and writing as recognizing letters and symbols becomes more difficult. And finally, for the interoceptive sense, these kiddos have difficulty understanding what their bodies are trying to tell them. And so this can cause an increase in toileting accidents or not appropriately responding to hunger cues. So that may be skipping meals and not even noticing, or that could be constantly feeling hungry nonstop. Next, we have sensory-based motor disorder. So again, this is the ability to coordinate movements of the body according to sensory output. When someone experiences deficits in this, they can have trouble with balance, gross and fine motor coordination that can all impact performance in daily activities. The first disorder under this is postural disorder. So with these children, they typically have difficulty interpreting their body position and they may struggle with weakness and endurance, oftentimes resulting in minimal motivation and success with movement activities. So they may have very little motivation to run, jump, skip, play in that kind of way. Their bilateral coordination, so that's using both sides of the body, might be very tricky, and they may have difficulty following objects with their eyes. And then the next disorder we have is dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is when someone has difficulty understanding, planning, and executing motor movements. With this disorder, individuals usually experience deficits in one of these 3 areas: ideation, motor planning, and execution. Ideation is essentially the step of figuring out what to do with your body to perform a task. So, someone with an ideation deficit may have difficulty with activities like generating new ways to interact with a toy or understanding the appropriate way to interact with the toy. So, they see a hairbrush and they don't automatically try to brush their hair with it. Motor planning is the brain's ability to figure out the steps, timing, and coordination that is needed to carry out a movement after the idea has been formed. So at this point, the idea is there. They understand this is how I should react and interact with this toy, but they must essentially plan out how they're going to do that. So, someone with motor planning deficits may have difficulty with activities involving imitation. So, for example, things like follow the leader or learning a new dance, imitating clap patterns, or Simon Says can be difficult. Execution is the step where you take the idea and you have the plan on how you want to perform it, and now you actually have to actually do it. So, with execution deficits, a child may lack the physical skills to execute the task, and they may lack the ability to determine whether their performance was successful or unsuccessful. All three of these steps happen pretty quickly in our brains, and a lot of times it's kind of just a behind the scenes thing. It's not usually something that's played out step by step. So, if you're concerned about the possibility of your child struggling with this, an occupational therapist can help determine if this is something that is causing difficulty for your child. Oftentimes, when someone has sensory processing disorder, they typically exhibit behaviors that are linked to their sensory needs. So, when one sensory cup is too full, they may exhibit a meltdown. There's too much coming in, and their nervous system is just going crazy. If their sensory cup's not full enough, they may behave in ways that attempt to gain more input. So they might be running and jumping down the stairs, or crashing into walls, or chewing on things that you're not typically supposed to chew on, like non food items. It can be easy when this is occurring to think that these behaviors are only behavior based, but it can be helpful to explore the possibility of the sensory differences that might be a contributing factor. Like I said before, if you have concerns about your child's behaviors, consult your pediatrician. OTs can kind of zone in on this and determine, is this sensory related? Is it just behavior related? And where can we go from there? When implementing strategies at home, it is most effective to consult an occupational therapist. An OT can create an individualized treatment plan around your child's unique sensory needs. But a few things that you can try at home include heavy work activities. So, this is typically recommended before a child attempts a task that might result in a meltdown or dysregulation, or if that child is really seeking sensory input, they're spinning, or they're chewing on their shirt, you can offer this kind of input. Heavy work activities can be both calming and alerting to the nervous system. So, choosing one that acts in the way that the child's nervous system needs is very important. And so, that's why an OT is also important, because they can help you determine when each one is most appropriate. Some examples of heavy work activities include pushing a full laundry basket across the floor, doing animal walks, so crab walks or bear crawls, weighted blankets, jumping jacks, and so many more. One of the main strategies that can be useful for implementation at home is a sensory diet. A sensory diet is an individualized plan of physical activities and accommodations to help someone meet their sensory needs. So, there are activities for all 8 senses that can work to either alert or calm the nervous system. It is imperative to consult an occupational therapist to create and implement sensory diets. This is to ensure you're providing the right form of regulation and to allow gradual and successful introduction of sensory diets into your daily life. Some useful materials that you can go over as a parent to help you understand just a little bit more about this includes HARCLA. That's HARKLA. So they have a free podcast where they talk about all kinds of things sensory, and it can be really helpful. And then Sensational Brain can also be helpful in understanding sensory processing and sensory diets. They have all kinds of tools to help you implement these at home, but typically this resource is not free, so just something to keep in mind. And you can kind of see just a very small example of a sensory diet here on the slide. So for Christina, these are the activities she has determined help calm her body down and increase her attention. So all of these could be seen as heavy work activities. All of them, you're putting pressure and force through the joints, and that can be calming to the body. As I have hinted to several times in the last several slides, OTs play a vital role in sensory processing intervention. OTs demonstrate an in-depth understanding of sensory processing and sensory processing disorder, as well as the impact that these can have on participation in daily activities. OTs can create client-centered treatment approaches to help target successful participation in occupations. Some example interventions include creating and educating on implementation of sensory diets at home and in schools, recommending environmental modifications that meet a child's unique sensory needs, providing gradual exposure to new sensory experiences in order to minimize sensory overload, provide activities that help children understand and differentiate sensory inputs, and provide guidance and education on emotional regulation that might be linked to or exacerbated by sensory processing disorder. This is the handout that is associated with today's session, and this will be available on our website, which I will have linked here in a couple slides. If you filled out that pre-survey, I would greatly appreciate any feedback you can give me on the post-survey. Again, it is brief, it's anonymous, and it just helps me understand how to make these sessions better. This bolded link here is to our website, so you can type that directly into your web browser and it'll take you right there. And then the QR code on this slide will take you to a list of local Cheyenne, Wyoming resources that might be beneficial to you. So different mental health therapy clinics in town, occupational therapists, physical therapists, etc. Next week, we're going to talk about pediatric feeding, so I hope you tune in for that. And this is the QR code to the list of references that I use to help make this presentation. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope that you tune in next week.